Welcome to a Moment in Time podcast. I'm your host, Eric.
And I'm Freya.
Usually when we talk about a diagnosis, whether it's, medical or engineering or even solving a crime, there's this expectation of precision. Like, it's binary.
Right, it's either one thing or the other.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, it's broken. You have the empirical proof right in front of you.
We really crave that kind of certainty, don't we? We like our evidence to be neatly categorized, visible, and just entirely indisputable. I mean, it makes the world feel manageable.
It really does.
Yeah.
But then you step into the world of ancient history, specifically the history of the first century Near East, and suddenly that x-ray machine it's completely malfunctioning. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Oh, absolutely murky.
Which is exactly why the premise of the stack of sources you, our listener, sent us today is so utterly compelling. We are taking that murky landscape and imposing a pretty brutal constraint on it. We are stripping away the theology completely.
Which is hard to do with this topic.
Very hard.
Yeah.
But based on your research stack, we are throwing out the Bibles, ignoring any claims of divine inspiration, and asking a purely secular question. Can we prove the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth using only extra-biblical, secular evidence?
It's a fascinating thought experiment because it forces us to act strictly as historians, not theologians. If you can, imagine the space around us just shifting from a modern setup into this dimly lit ancient archive. The air is dry, dust motes are catching the light, and the tables are just covered in Roman scrolls, crumbling papyrus, heavy stone tablets.
I can picture it.
Yeah, and our job is to sift through this purely administrative and adversarial material. We are looking at the negative space. We want to see what the silhouette looks like when we only use the accounts of people who were entirely outside the Christian movement.
And to find that negative space, the most logical place to start is with the people who built the roads, collected the taxes, and basically controlled the known world at the time, the Roman Empire.
Right, the administrators.
Yeah. The sources you provided lean heavily into the Roman administrative records for a very specific reason. The Romans had absolutely zero incentive to invent a founder for a fringe movement that they found, frankly, politically annoying and socially repulsive.
This brings us to a foundational concept in historical methodology. It's called the criterion of hostile witness.
Which sounds like a legal term.
It basically is. If someone who is actively trying to destroy your reputation or your movement casually admits a foundational fact about you, well, historians weigh that admission extremely heavily. I mean, it serves the enemy no purpose to fabricate a detail that legitimizes your existence.
That makes total sense.
Right. And our primary hostile witness in this era is a man named Cornelius Tacitus.
Let's contextualize him, because he's not just some guy with a diary, right? Tacitus is writing his final major historical work, the Annals, around 116 to 117 CE, and he's recounting the events of 64 CE under the Emperor Nero. This is the year of the Great Fire of Rome.
Right, a massively chaotic time.
Half the city burns to the ground. The rumor mill in the Roman streets is just churning violently. Citizens are whispering that Nero himself ordered the fire to clear real estate for his massive new talus, the Domus Aurea. Nero realizes a mob is about to turn on him, so he desperately needs a scapegoat.
He has to point the finger somewhere.
Exactly. So he points it at a newly emerging, highly unpopular group in the city whom the crowds called Christians.
And Tacitus describes this scene with absolute disgust, not just for Nero's cruelty, which he hated, but for the Christians themselves. He writes that the founder of this name, Christus, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate.
He actually names them all.
He does. Tacitus goes on to call their beliefs a deadly superstition that broke out in Judea and had now poured into Rome, which he famously calls the place where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center.
Wow. Tell us how you really feel, Tacitus. But okay, I look at that 116 CE date, and a giant red flag goes up for me. That is 85 years after the supposed crucifixion in Judea, around 30 CE.
That's a fair point.
Right, because if a modern journalist wrote an expose about World War II today in the 2020s, and they didn't cite any primary sources or contemporary documents, we'd laugh them out of the room. So is it possible Tacitus is just repeating the hearsay of the Christians themselves? Just parroting what the cultists in Rome were claiming about their own origins?
That is the exact skeptical pushback we should apply. But understanding Roman historiography, and specifically Tacitus's own methodology, it really dismantles that idea. Tacitus was arguably the most meticulous historian Rome ever produced.
Really? The most meticulous.
Without a doubt. He was a Roman senator, yes, but more importantly for this specific question, he was a member of the Quindecimviri Sacris Faciundis.
The Board of 15, right?
Precisely. This was an elite, high-ranking priestly organization, and their explicit, legally mandated job was to supervise foreign cults operating within Rome. Monitoring weird new religions was literally his jurisdiction.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So because of this role and his status as a senator, Tacitus had direct access to the Acta Senatus. Those are the official archives of the Roman Senate and the imperial logs. He wasn't relying on street gossip.
You could just go read the files.
Exactly. And beyond his access, we have to look at his psychology. He hated this group. He thought they were a disease. The absolute last thing a proud, aristocratic Roman senator would do is take the word of a despised underground cult of peasants and slaves at face value.
Right. He wouldn't just take their word for it.
No way. If he investigated their claims and found out they were worshiping a phantom, like a completely fabricated historical figure, he would have gleefully exposed that. He would have written, "These fools worship a man who never even lived." But instead, he matter-of-factly anchors their founder, Christus, in highly specific Roman administrative history. He names the emperor, he names the location, and he names the executioner.
But speaking of that executioner, the sources point out a flaw that skeptics just love to highlight. A supposed error in Tacitus's meticulous record. He calls Pontius Pilate a procurator. But we know from both other Roman historians and from physical dirt-level archaeology, which we are absolutely going to dig into later, that Pilate's actual official title during his time in Judea was praefectus, or prefect.
Right, the titles don't match.
Yeah. If Tacitus is checking the imperial logs, how does he get the governor's job title wrong?
It looks like a glaring error to modernize, for sure, but it's actually a recognized literary device called anachronism, and it was widely used in ancient historical writing for the sake of the audience.
Okay, how so?
Well, we have to trace the evolution of Roman administration in Judea. In the early days of Roman occupation, under Emperor Augustus and Emperor Tiberius, which is when Pilate ruled, the governors were indeed military men carrying the title of prefect. However, a couple of decades later, under Emperor Claudius, the administrative structure shifted. The governors were given civil and financial authority, and the title officially changed to procurator.
Ah, so Tacitus was writing in 116 CE, when a term procurator had been the standard everyday term for the governor of Judea for over 60 years.
Exactly. It's a translation of context for his contemporaries. Think about how a historian today might write about the Second World War. They might casually refer to Henry Stimson as the Secretary of Defense.
Even though the Department of Defense didn't exist yet.
Right. During World War II, Stimson's actual legal title was the Secretary of War. But a modern writer might use Secretary of Defense because a 21st century audience instantly understands what that role entails. It's an anachronism designed for clarity. It doesn't mean the historian is ignorant, and it certainly doesn't mean Henry Stimson was a mythical figure.
That makes perfect sense when you put it like that. And Tacitus isn't isolated. The Roman dossier in our stack includes two other heavyweights, Pliny the Younger and Suetonius. Pliny gives us this incredible window into the sociology of the movement.
He really does.
He's the Roman governor in Bithynia, which is modern-day northern Turkey. And around 110 CE, he writes this slightly panicked letter to Emperor Trajan. Pliny is basically saying, I have these people called Christians, and I don't know the legal precedent for prosecuting them. He even admits to torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses to extract information.
And the detail Pliny extracts is just vital. He reports back to the emperor that their primary crime, like the sum total of their guilt, seems to be that they meet before dawn on a fixed day to sing hymns to Christ as to a god, and they take an oath not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery.
Just a moral oath.
Right. But what Pliny is documenting, independently of any Christian text, is that by the early 2nd century, in a province far removed from Judea, this figure is already being worshipped in divine categories.
Then we have Suetonius, the Roman historian and lawyer. He's writing about events that took place even earlier, around 49 CE, right in the capital city of Rome. He writes that Emperor Claudius actually expelled the Jewish population from Rome because they were constantly rioting at the instigation of a man named Christus.
Now, this requires a bit of linguistic untangling, which your sources highlight brilliantly. Christus is the Latinized version of the Greek word Christos, which simply means anointed one. It's a title, not a name.
Right.
However, Crestus, spelled with an E instead of an I, was a remarkably common Roman name, particularly given to slaves and freedmen. It literally meant useful or good.
So if you're a Roman centurion breaking up a massive riot in the Jewish quarter.
Chaos everywhere.
Yeah, total chaos. And you're interrogating people in this loud marketplace, and they keep shouting about how this was about Christus.
The Roman official, completely unfamiliar with Jewish messianic theology, would easily mishear the Greek title Christus as the familiar everyday Roman street name Crestus. Suetonius likely checked the police reports from 49 CE and genuinely believed there was a literal, physical agitator named Crestus running through the alleys of Rome organizing riots.
When in reality,
what he was documenting was the Jewish community in Rome violently fracturing over the theological debate of whether Jesus of Nazareth was the promised Messiah.
when you pull back and look at this Roman dossier, Tacitus, Pliny, Suetonius, what strikes me isn't the theology, it's the sheer velocity of the sociological footprint. I mean, think about the timeline. The crucifixion happens roughly around 30 CE in Jerusalem, which is an absolute backwater province on the fringes of the empire.
A total outpost.
Yeah. But by 49 CE, less than 20 years later, the debate over this man is causing riots so severe in the capital city that the emperor has to deport people. By 64 CE, they are a distinct enough demographic in Rome to serve as a scapegoat for Nero. This isn't a myth that took centuries to slowly formulate in the mists of time. It's a rapid, socially explosive phenomenon that forced the Roman bureaucracy to acknowledge it almost immediately.
The Romans provide the view from the outside looking in, right? Confused, annoyed, bureaucratic.
Yeah.
But to get a comprehensive historical picture, we have to pivot. We need to know how the local Judean historians and the religious authorities, the people living at ground zero of this movement, viewed it.
Which brings us to one of the most polarizing and complex figures of the ancient world, Flavius Josephus. If you were writing a screenplay about the first century, Josephus would be your unreliable, completely fascinating narrator.
Oh, absolutely. His biography is essential for understanding his credibility. Born Yosef ben Matityahu, he is an aristocratic, highly educated Jewish priest. When the First Jewish-Roman War breaks out in 66 CE, he actually serves as a military commander for the Jewish rebel forces in Galilee.
So he's fighting the Romans.
He fights them. But he is eventually cornered and captured by the Roman general Vespasian at the siege of Yodfat.
And here is where he pulls off the ultimate survival maneuver. Instead of being executed or enslaved, Josephus looks at the Roman general and prophesies that Vespasian will soon become the emperor of Rome.
It's a bold move.
Incredibly bold. But a couple of years later, Rome goes through the year of the four emperors, this massive civil war, and sure enough, Vespasian emerges as the emperor.
And Vespasian remembers the Jewish prisoner who predicted his rise, so he frees him. Josephus moves to Rome, takes the emperor's family name, Flavius, and spends the rest of his life writing massive historical volumes funded by the Flavian dynasty, the very same dynasty that just destroyed the Jewish temple and burned Jerusalem to the ground.
To the Jewish survivors, he is the ultimate quisling. I mean, a traitor of the highest order. But for us, sitting in our modern archive looking for secular evidence, his unique position is a goldmine.
Exactly.
He's completely secure in his Roman patronage, meaning he doesn't have to pander to popular Jewish opinion. Yet, he is deeply and proudly Jewish in his heritage, writing these huge texts to explain Jewish history to the Greco-Roman world. And in his masterwork, Jewish Antiquities, published around 93 CE, he explicitly mentions Jesus twice.
The first mention, found in Book 20, is almost universally accepted by modern historians precisely because it is so incredibly mundane. Josephus is detailing a very specific political crisis in Jerusalem around 62 CE. The Roman governor, Festus, has unexpectedly died. There is a lag time before his replacement, Albinus, arrives from Rome.
Leaving a power vacuum.
Right, and the Jewish high priest, a ruthless man named Ananus, exploits this temporary power vacuum to settle some scores.
Josephus writes that Ananus convenes the Sanhedrin and brings before them a man named James, whom Josephus identifies specifically as the brother of Jesus who is called Messiah. He says James and some others were condemned and stoned to death.
The historiographical value of this sentence lies in its sheer functionality. James, or Jacob in Hebrew, was an incredibly common name in first-century Judea. Josephus himself mentions dozens of different men named James in his writings.
You can't just say James.
Exactly. To specify which James was executed by Ananus, he can't just say James, the son of Joseph, because Joseph was also a very common name. He has to use a recognizable anchor. So he identifies James by his more culturally notorious brother.
But even the name Jesus was common. The sources point out Josephus writes about at least a dozen different men named Jesus, Jesus son of Damnius, Jesus son of Gamaliel. So he has to add a highly specific qualifier.
He adds the phrase who is called Messiah, or ton legomenon Christen in the Greek. Notice the detachment in the phrasing. He doesn't say Jesus was the Messiah. He says this is the Jesus whom certain people call the Messiah.
Very clinical.
Very. It's a completely neutral descriptive tag. Furthermore, the passage isn't even about Jesus. The focus of the narrative is on the corruption of the high priest Ananus, and how this illegal execution ultimately got Ananus deposed when the new Roman governor finally arrived. If Jesus of Nazareth had never existed, using his name to identify a specific political prisoner would be nonsensical. The casual, incidental nature of the reference is exactly what makes it so historically bulletproof.
But then we flip back a few chapters to Book 18 of Antiquities, and we walk right into a historiographical minefield. This is the Testimonium Flavianum. It is a much longer paragraph where Josephus seemingly drops his neutral tone and writes a glowing, deeply reverent summary of Jesus' life, his miracles, his crucifixion under Pilate, and his resurrection on the third day.
The traditional Greek manuscripts of this passage read like a Christian creed. They contain phrases like, "He was the Messiah, and he appeared to them spending a third day restored to life," which immediately presents a massive contextual problem.
Because of who Josephus was.
Right. Josephus was an Orthodox, non-Christian Jew who died a non-Christian Jew. He believed the Roman Emperor Vespasian was the fulfillment of Jewish messianic prophecies, not a crucified carpenter from Galilee.
So if we are applying rigorous secular methodology, how do historians handle a text that clearly looks like it was tampered with? Our sources break down three distinct camps of scholarship on this. Camp 1 argues the text is entirely authentic as written. But almost no serious academic holds this view today because the theology radically contradicts everything else we know about Josephus.
Camp 2 is the exact opposite. They argue the entire passage is a wholesale forgery, completely invented and inserted into the text centuries later by Christian scribes. But this view is also largely rejected by modern scholarship.
Why is that?
Because when you strip away the overtly miraculous claims, the remaining core of the passage relies on vocabulary and grammatical structures that are uniquely Josephine. The way the text describes Jesus as a doer of startling deeds or a teacher of people who receive the truth with pleasure, those are phrases Josephus uses elsewhere in his writings. But they are very uncharacteristic of early Christian terminology. Early Christians called Jesus Lord and Savior, not a doer of startling deeds.
Which brings us to Camp 3, the overwhelming academic consensus, the partial interpolation theory. The idea is that Josephus originally wrote a neutral, perhaps slightly dismissive historical summary of Jesus. But as his manuscripts were copied by Christian monks over the centuries, those scribes couldn't resist improving the text by adding their own theological confessions into the margins, which eventually got baked into the main text.
And we don't have to just guess that this happened. The brilliant part of the research you've provided, our listener, is that we can literally trace the textual tampering by stepping outside the Greek manuscript tradition. Because Josephus's works were so massive and popular, they were translated into other languages very early on.
This is where it gets incredibly cool. Scholars found a 10th century Arabic manuscript by a historian named Agapius and a 12th century Syriac manuscript by a patriarch named Michael the Syrian. Because these translations were sequestered away in the Middle East, outside the bubble of the Byzantine Greek Orthodox scribes who were doing all the copying in Europe, they preserved an older, much less embellished version of the text.
The differences are the smoking gun of interpolation, where the Greek text aggressively asserts he was the Messiah. The Arabic version softly states he was perhaps the Messiah. Where the Greek says he rose from the dead, the Syriac version says he was thought to be the Messiah. And we even have a Latin translation by Jerome from the 4th century that reads, he was believed to be the Messiah.
It perfectly proves the consensus view. There was a neutral, secular, authentically Josephine core text circulating in the ancient world. Once historians use these foreign manuscripts to digitally scrub away the obvious Christian graffiti added by later Greek scribes, they are left with a historically solid paragraph confirming that Jesus was a wise teacher. He gathered a large following of Jews and Greeks. He was condemned to the cross by Pilate at the suggestion of the principal men among them, and his followers did not abandon him after his death.
It's an astonishing secular corroboration.
It really is. So we have established the Roman view and the Jewish aristocratic view, but we still need to examine the perspective of the religious establishment itself. The rabbis who were actively debating and frequently clashing with this new sect in the centuries that followed.
Right, the insider opposition.
Exactly. If you think about this from the perspective of a prosecutor building a case, this next piece of evidence is the ultimate historical irony. We are looking at the rabbinic records, specifically the Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 3rd and 6th centuries, which preserves much older oral traditions from the Jewish academies. In the tractate Sanhedrin 43a, we find a record regarding the execution of Yeshu HaNosri, Jesus the Nazarene.
The Talmud states that Yeshu was hanged on the eve of Passover. It claims that for 40 days before the execution, a herald went forth crying out that he was going to be stoned because he had practiced sorcery and had enticed and led Israel astray. It asks if anyone has anything to say in his defense, and since nothing was brought forward, he was hanged on the eve of Passover.
The genius of this source is what it doesn't say. If anyone in the ancient Mediterranean world had the motive, the means, the theological imperative, and the opportunity to argue that Jesus of Nazareth was a complete myth, it was the rabbinic authorities. They were engaged in fierce theological warfare with early Christians. If Jesus never existed, the absolute most devastating argument the rabbis could have deployed would have been to simply look at the Christians and say, "You are worshiping a phantom. We control the temple records, we know the genealogies, we know the history of the city. There was no Jesus of Nazareth. You invented him."
But they never make that argument, not once in all of antiquity. Instead of denying his historical existence, they acknowledge his life and attempt to reframe it. They take the raw data of his life, his ability to perform unexplainable feats and his execution by the authorities, and they apply a hostile theological lens to it.
They don't deny the miracles. They say he was a sorcerer who used dark magic. Which, by the way, under Deuteronomy 13, practicing sorcery and leading the people into apostasy was a capital offense.
Exactly the point. You do not hold a trial for a myth. You do not issue a 40-day call for defense witnesses for metaphor. You do not execute a solar deity. The Talmud's aggressive attack on his character is a concrete, undeniable admission of his physical, historical reality. The bedrock events of his life are entirely undisputed by the very people who had the most to gain by erasing him from history.
So we've covered the politicians, the historians, and the priests. But this movement didn't stay in Judea. It lead out into the broader Mediterranean. When it hit the sophisticated philosophical hubs in Greece and Rome, how did the intellectuals, the satirists, the Stoics, react to a group worshipping a crucified Galilean peasant?
The intellectual reaction is a fascinating mix of complete bafflement, cynical mockery, and occasional philosophical respect. If we want to see the mockery, we look at a 2nd century Greek satirist named Lucian of Samosata. Lucian was essentially the ancient equivalent of a cynical late-night comedian.
Stand-up comic.
Basically. He wrote a piece called The Passing of Peregrinus, which is a biting satire about a man who briefly joins the Christians before abandoning them to become a cynic philosopher.
And Lucian uses this story to just mercilessly roast the Christians. He calls Jesus a crucified sophist, which is a highly specific, loaded insult in the Greek world. A sophist was a term used for philosophers who cared more about rhetoric than truth, or teachers who only taught to extract money from their students. Basically, a cheat.
Lucian mocks the Christians for their sheer gullibility. He laughs at the fact that they worship this executed criminal and that they live by his bizarre laws, which apparently included treating everyone as brothers and freely giving away all their wealth. He says any charlatan can walk into a Christian community and become rich instantly because they are so naive and trusting.
But the brilliance of bringing Lucian into our secular dossier is the underlying assumption of his satire. The mockery only lands, the joke only works, if the audience intrinsically knows that the historical premise is real. You can't write a biting sociocultural satire about the societal impact of a person who never existed.
Right, the joke falls flat otherwise.
Exactly. Lucian despises them. But his contempt is entirely predicated on the established historical reality of the man who was crucified. Without naming Jesus directly, Lucian corroborates the movement's origin in Palestine, the crucifixion of its founder, and the radical economic and social behavior of his early followers.
But not all secular intellectuals viewed him with such contempt. If we look at a source from a slightly earlier period, we find a very different, deeply poignant philosophical tone. We have a letter written by a man named Mara bar Serapion.
And the context of this letter is pretty heartbreaking. Mara is a Syrian Stoic philosopher. Sometime after 73 CE, his city, Samosata, is conquered by the Romans. He's taken as a prisoner of war. While sitting in a Roman prison facing execution or life of slavery, he writes a letter of moral instruction to his son, Serapion.
It's a classic text of Stoic philosophy. He is trying to teach his son how to maintain virtue, wisdom, and inner composure when the external world is subjecting you to unjust cruelty and misfortune. To illustrate his point, Mara uses 3 historical examples of societies that unjustly persecuted wise men, and how those societies were ultimately punished by the universe for their arrogance.
He writes, "What advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates? None. They were punished with famine and plague. What advantage did the men of Samos gain by burning Pythagoras? None. Their land was completely covered in sand. And what advantage did the Jews gain by executing their wise king? None, because soon after their kingdom was destroyed and they were driven into exile."
The reference to the destruction of the kingdom and the exile perfectly aligns with the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. But Mara bar Serapion goes on to say that these wise men didn't truly die. Their wisdom lives on. Socrates lives on through the teachings of Plato, Pythagoras lives on through the statue of Hera, and the wise king lives on through the new law he laid down.
Now, the historiography surrounding this letter is debated, which your sources rightly point out. Scholars like Robert Van Voorst argue confidently that the wise king is an undeniable reference to Jesus. But other historians, like Craig A. Evans, urge caution. They point out that Mara never uses the name Jesus, he never uses the title Christ, and crucially, he makes 0 mention of a resurrection.
And that absence of the resurrection is precisely what makes the letter so valuable to a secular historian. If this letter had been forged by a Christian or heavily influenced by Christian theology, they could not have resisted including the resurrection. For early Christians, the resurrection was the entire point of the religion.
They couldn't help themselves.
Exactly. But Mara bar Serapion doesn't view Jesus as a divine savior who conquered death. He views him entirely through the lens of pagan Stoic philosophy. He categorizes Jesus as an elite moral philosopher, placing him on the exact same historical tier as Socrates and Pythagoras, a brilliant human teacher whose ethical laws outlived his unjust political execution.
What this proves is that within a single generation of the crucifixion, by the 70s CE, the archetype of this crucified Jewish teacher had already escaped the confines of theological debate in Judea. It had permeated the secular philosophical consciousness of the Mediterranean. Even pagan intellectuals who didn't believe he was God recognized his historical existence and the tragedy of his death.
The historical texts from Tacitus to the Talmud to Mara bar Serapion, they really weave a tightly bound consensus. But the sources you provided do something incredibly brave. They don't just present the mainstream consensus, they also include a highly detailed, radically alternative theory about who this historical figure actually was.
This is where we have to dive deep into the weeds of historical revisionism, because the sources contain an intricate counter-theory that argues Jesus of Nazareth, as depicted in the Gospels, didn't exist in 30 CE. Instead, the hypothesis suggests that the Jesus narrative is actually an encoded, sanitized biography of a heavily documented, violent first-century revolutionary named Judas the Galilean.
To evaluate this impartially, we have to understand how this theory deconstructs the established timeline and relies on a concept called chronological conflation. The traditional mainstream timeline places the birth of Jesus somewhere around 4 BCE to 6 CE and his crucifixion under Pilate around 30 CE.
But the Judas the Galilean theory looks at the birth narratives in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke and says, wait a minute, these dates clash. Matthew's Gospel says Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, who died in 4 BCE. Luke's Gospel ties the birth of Jesus to the massive Roman census conducted by Quirinius, which we know from Roman records happened in 6 CE. That's a 10-year gap.
A significant chunk of time.
Yeah. The traditional explanation is that ancient biographers weren't precise with dates, or that Luke made an administrative error regarding when Quirinius held power.
But the alternative theory argues this isn't an error. It argues these 2 dates, 4 BCE and 6 CE, are actually the 2 defining historical anchors in the life of Judas the Galilean. In 4 BCE, when Herod the Great was dying, Judas and his followers incited a massive uprising in Jerusalem, pulling down the golden Roman eagle that Herod had erected over the temple gates. The leaders were burned alive, but the movement sparked a rebellion.
Wow.
Then, 10 years later, in 6 CE, when Rome imposed the Quirinius census to tax Judea directly, Judas the Galilean led a massive nationwide tax revolt.
So the theory posits that early Christian writers intentionally split the timeline. They took the major geopolitical events of Judas the Galilean's actual life, 4 BCE and 6 CE, and repurposed them as the birth of the Messiah, effectively scrubbing the violent revolutionary nature of his actions and shifting his adult ministry 30 years into the future to 30 CE to make him a peaceful spiritual savior acceptable to a Roman audience.
The theory then stacks parallel upon parallel. It looks at geography. Judas the Galilean famously raided the royal armory in the city of Sepphoris in Galilee. Jesus is famously from Nazareth, a tiny hamlet situated just a couple of miles from Sepphoris. The theory implies Nazareth might be a geographical sleight of hand.
And the ideological parallels are, well, they're fascinating. Judas the Galilean founded a movement that Josephus called the Fourth Philosophy. Its core tenets were a refusal to pay taxes to Rome, claiming God was their only ruler, and a demand for a radical, almost pure form of communism, like the burning of debt records and the complete redistribution of wealth.
Right.
The theory points out how closely this maps onto Jesus telling the rich young ruler to sell everything he owns, and how the book of Acts describes the earliest Christians pooling all their resources and sharing all their property in common.
To solidify the timeline shift, the theory relies heavily on a deeply controversial text known as the Slavonic Josephus. This is an old Russian translation of Josephus's Jewish War that surfaced in the Middle Ages. Unlike the standard Greek versions, the Slavonic text contains passages about John the Baptist and Jesus. Crucially, the Slavonic text places the ministry of John the Baptist in 6 CE.
Which perfectly aligns with the height of Judas the Galilean's anti-tax revolt. And the theory notes that both movements utilized a dual leadership structure. Judas the Galilean led his revolt alongside a Pharisee named Sadduc. Jesus began his ministry alongside John the Baptist and later led alongside Peter.
When you lay all these pieces out, the timeline anomalies, the geographical proximity, the radical economic teachings, and the dual leadership, it paints a mesmerizing picture of historical conflation. But as historians evaluating the full weight of the evidence, we have to explain why this remains a fringe theory.
Why does the academic consensus reject it? Because it sounds pretty compelling when you list it all out.
It does sound compelling, but it's because of what the theory requires you to discard. To accept that Jesus and Judas the Galilean were the same person, you have to throw out the entire Roman administrative record we just discussed. You have to assume Tacitus was completely wrong about the crucifixion happening under Pilate, who ruled from 26 to 36 CE, decades after Judas's revolt. You have to assume Josephus's neutral reference to James in 62 CE was entirely fabricated. You have to believe that thousands of early Christians successfully orchestrated a flawless, empire-wide conspiracy to invent a fake 30-year chronological gap, and that none of their Jewish or Roman enemies ever caught on or called them out on the timeline shift.
Yeah, that's just an impossibly complex conspiracy theory for the ancient world.
Yeah.
You couldn't coordinate a lie that massive across a geography that wide without someone, like the rabbis in the Talmud, pointing out that Jesus actually died in 6 CE, not 30 CE.
Precisely. However, exploring this theory is incredibly valuable because it highlights a massive historiographical truth about first-century Judea. The era was a socio-political pressure cooker. It was defined by brutal Roman occupation, crippling taxation, and deep religious fervor. What the Judas the Galilean parallels actually prove is that the archetype of Jesus, a charismatic Galilean teacher, fiercely devoted to the law, demanding radical economic justice, clashing with the temple establishment, and ultimately facing execution by Rome, was not a bizarre anomaly.
They were cut from the same cloth.
Right. Jesus and Judas were not the same man, but they were born from the exact same historical soil. There are variations on a first-century messianic theme.
The texts, the theories, the chronologies, I mean, you can debate them infinitely. You can argue about what a Greek prefix means or whether a Russian translation preserves an Aramaic original. But eventually, if a historical movement was as massive and disruptive as the Romans and the Jews claim it was, it has to leave a physical footprint. The texts have to anchor to reality. We have to look at the dirt.
We are shifting our focus from literary analysis to archaeology. Material culture is entirely immune to theological bias. A stone cannot be interpolated by a medieval scribe.
Let's start with the ultimate anchor, the Pilate stone. For centuries, skeptics of the historical Jesus had a very strong argument. They pointed out that outside the New Testament and a few historians writing decades later, there was zero physical contemporary proof that a man named Pontius Pilate ever existed, let alone served as the Roman governor of Judea. He was treated by some as a literary device invented to shift the blame for the crucifixion away from the Jews and onto the Romans.
That entire skeptical argument collapsed in 1961. A team of Italian archaeologists, led by Dr. Antonio Frova, was excavating the ruins of Caesarea Maritima, located on the Mediterranean coast of Israel. In the first century, Jerusalem was the religious center, but Caesarea was the Roman administrative capital. They were excavating the ancient Roman theater, and they found a massive block of limestone that had been repurposed by later builders as a stair-step.
When they flipped the step over, they found a damaged but entirely legible Latin inscription. It reads, in part, Tiberium, Pontius Pilatus, Praefectus Iudae. It was a dedication stone for a temple honoring Emperor Tiberius, commissioned by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea.
The historical ramifications of this single stone are immense. First, it irrefutably anchors the central political antagonist of the crucifixion narrative in the physical contemporary record. Pilate was a real man who walked the streets of Caesarea and commissioned buildings. But second, it ties back perfectly to our earlier discussion about Tacitus and the anachronism.
Oh, wow, yes. The stone literally says prefectus, not procurator.
Exactly. The archaeology solves the textual debate. It proves that in Pilate's actual lifetime, his title was prefect. Tacitus, writing 80 years later, updated the term to procurator for his audience. The stone vindicates both the existence of Pilate and the administrative accuracy of the early timeline.
We also see the timeline anchored through ossuaries, ancient Jewish bone boxes used for secondary burial in the 1st century. Your sources bring up the Caiaphas ossuary, discovered in a burial cave in Jerusalem in 1990. It's a highly ornate limestone box containing the remains of several people, including a 60-year-old man, and inscribed on the side is the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas.
Caiaphas is, of course, the Jewish high priest who, according to the historical accounts, presided over the trial of Jesus. While finding an ossuary doesn't prove the trial happened, it anchors the specific priestly family name mentioned in the texts directly to the correct era, the correct city, and the correct aristocratic social stratum.
I want to pause here because the sources you provided do something that is crucial for rigorous historical investigation.
Yeah.
They don't just accept every piece of sensational archaeology, they actively dismiss weak evidence.
That's so important.
Yeah. The sources explicitly reject the famous James ossuary, the box that purportedly reads James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. They point out that it surfaced through the antiquities market, not a controlled archaeological dig, meaning its provenance is entirely unproven, and the inscription could very well be a modern forgery. The sources also completely dismiss the East Talpia tomb, which some highly publicized documentaries tried to claim was the actual family tomb of Jesus, full of his family's ossuaries.
That rigorous skepticism is vital. Good historiography requires you to aggressively prune away weak, unprovenced evidence. If you build your case on a potentially forged bone box bought from an antiquities dealer, your entire argument collapses when the box is discredited. The historical reality of Jesus doesn't need sensationalized documentaries. The undisputed archaeology like the Pilate stone or the Gallio inscription found in Delphi, which definitively dates the Roman proconsul Gallio to 51 CE, allowing us to reverse engineer the timeline of the early Christian expansion, is more than enough to peg the movement directly to verifiable Roman administrative history.
But the most visually striking piece of material culture in your sources isn't a political dedication or a bone box. It's a mosaic floor. And its location is staggering. We are talking about the Megiddo mosaic, which was discovered inside the grounds of the Megiddo maximum security prison in modern-day Israel.
The juxtaposition is incredible. You have one of the most secure, modern prisons in the world, and beneath the feet of the inmates and guards, archaeologists uncover the remains of a 3rd century building. Based on the architecture and the artifacts, it is widely believed to be the earliest known Christian prayer hall ever discovered. And remember the timeline, the 3rd century is decades before Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. This was an era when the religion was still periodically outlawed and persecuted.
And the mosaic floor itself tells a story. It was paid for by a Roman centurion named Gaius, a Roman military officer funding an illegal Christian prayer hall. But the centerpiece is a specific dedication made by a woman named Akeptos. The inscription, written in Greek, says she offered the table to God Jesus Christ as a memorial.
The phrasing of that inscription, to God Jesus Christ, is a historical earthquake. In the original Greek mosaic tiles, the artisan used nomina sacra. These are sacred abbreviations, indicated by drawing a line over specific letters, used exclusively by early Christians for holy names. The mosaic reads Tute Shiai Sufto.
Why does finding that specific phrasing on a floor in the 3rd century matter so much to a historian? I mean, why is it an earthquake?
Because for a long time, there was a prevalent historical theory that high Christology, the theological idea of worshiping Jesus of Nazareth fully as God, was a late invention. The theory suggested that early Christians just viewed him as a human prophet, and it wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, under the political pressure of Emperor Constantine, that the Church voted to elevate Jesus to divine status.
But this mosaic shatters that theory.
Completely. This isn't a theological treatise being debated by elite scholars in a council chamber in the 4th century. This is material culture. This is an artisan laying tiles in a rural village in the 3rd century, openly referring to Jesus as God, funded by a Roman soldier. It proves that high Christology was happening on the ground, in public, among ordinary working-class people, long before the empire ever legalized or codified the religion. It pushes the timeline of divine worship back into the dirt of antiquity.
Which provides the perfect bridge to our final major area of secular evidence. We have established the political reality through the Roman historians, the sociological reality through the Jewish texts, and the physical reality through the archaeology. Now, we must turn to the texts of the New Testament themselves. But adhering strictly to our mission, we are not opening these books to read them as inspired scripture. We are analyzing them coldly, purely as physical historical artifacts and as containers of ancient oral tradition.
We are engaging in textual criticism. We are treating the New Testament the exact same way a historian treats the writings of Homer, Plato, or Julius Caesar.
Let's start with the sheer physical volume. I call this the manuscript mountain. The sources point out that scholars have cataloged over 5,600 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament.
That number is difficult to conceptualize until you compare it to the rest of classical antiquity. For the average classical Greek or Roman author, say, the histories of Herodotus or the annals of Tacitus, we typically possess only a handful of surviving manuscripts, 10, maybe 20 copies. And crucially, the earliest surviving copies we have for most classical authors were usually written in the Middle Ages, often 800 to 1,000 years after the original author died.
This is the massive methodological irony that your sources expose. Modern society and modern historians fully accept the histories of Tacitus, the conquests of Caesar, and the philosophy of Plato as established historical fact. Nobody doubts they existed. Yet we trust their histories based on medieval copies separated from the events by a millennium. Conversely, some extreme skeptics attempt to dismiss the entire New Testament as historically useless, despite the fact that it is supported by a mountain of over 5,600 ancient witnesses, with fragments dating to within decades of the original compositions.
It is a severe double standard in historical methodology. Now, as secular historians, we must clarify. Possessing 5,600 manuscripts does not magically prove that the miracles recorded in those manuscripts actually happened. Textual abundance does not equal theological truth. But what that mountain of manuscripts does provide is an exceptionally rich, unrivaled basis for textual criticism. Because we have thousands of copies from different regions and different centuries, historians can cross-reference the variations and reconstruct the original text with astonishing accuracy. We aren't left guessing what the first-century document said. We have the data to prove it.
And some of those physical artifacts are incredibly early. Let's look at Papyrus 52, or P52. This is a tiny, fragile scrap of papyrus currently housed in the John Rylands Library in Manchester. It's barely the size of a credit card. It contains a few fragmented lines from the Gospel of John, specifically the trial scene between Jesus and Pilate, where Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?"
Papyrologists, using the science of paleography, which is the study of ancient handwriting styles, generally date this tiny fragment to the early 2nd century, perhaps around 125 to 150 CE.
The date is amazing, but the geography is what makes it profound. Where was this fragment found?
It was discovered in the dry sands of the Egyptian interior. Why does that matter? Because historical consensus suggests the Gospel of John was originally composed somewhere in Asia Minor, likely Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, or perhaps in Syria toward the very end of the 1st century.
So for a physical copy of that text to have been copied, transported across the Mediterranean Sea, carried all the way down the Nile River into the deep Egyptian interior, and then read, worn out, and discarded by roughly 125 CE.
It means the text was circulating materially, widely, and at what passes for lightning speed in the ancient world. It proves the narrative of Jesus wasn't a localized regional myth that took 3 centuries to slowly creep across the map. The texts were proliferating across imperial borders almost immediately.
But even before those papyrus texts were written down, there was an oral culture, a memory culture. And the sources reveal that embedded deep within the letters of the Apostle Paul, there are these tiny, highly compressed, pre-existing creeds.
This is the study of tradition history. Scholars look at texts like 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Philippians chapter 2, and 1 Corinthians chapter 8. They isolate these passages because the vocabulary and the rhythm of the Greek suddenly change. Paul stops writing in his normal argumentative prose, and he starts quoting highly stylized poetry or hymns.
In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day.
The key to unlocking that passage as a historian lies in the verbs. Received and passed on, paralambanu and perdidumi in the Greek. These are not casual words. These are the highly specific technical rabbinic terms used in Jewish academies for the authoritative passing down of sacred oral tradition from a teacher to a student. Paul is explicitly signaling to his readers, I did not invent the poem I am about to quote. I was taught it.
And the timeline compression here is devastating to the myth theory. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around 55 CE. That is barely 25 years after the crucifixion in 30 CE. But he is quoting a formula that he received years earlier. Most historians trace his reception of that creed back to his visit to Jerusalem, where he met with Peter and James. That visit happened within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion.
It completely collapses the evolutionary model of myth-making. The old sociological theory was that Jesus was just a wandering apocalyptic sage, and over hundreds of years, like a giant game of telephone, his legend slowly grew and grew until people finally decided to call him divine. But these embedded creeds prove the exact opposite. They prove that high Christology, using divine categories, claiming lordship, professing a bodily resurrection, was not a late theological inflation. It was the immediate baseline reaction of his earliest followers within months, or, at most, a few years of his death.
It forces the secular historian into a corner. You have to ask, what on earth happened in Jerusalem in 30 CE that generated such an immediate, explosive, and doctrinally sophisticated response from a group of first-century Jewish monotheists who abhorred the idea of a human being God?
Exactly. When you synthesize this entire journey, taking it entirely out of the realm of theology and keeping it strictly in the bounds of secular historical inquiry, the consensus becomes overwhelming. You brought us hostile Roman senators, complaining about a deadly superstition, anchoring the founder to Pilate. You brought us a complex Jewish aristocrat using Jesus to identify a political prisoner and leaving behind a core testament of crucifixion. We saw cynical Greek satirists mocking a crucified sophist and a stoic philosopher lamenting a murdered wise king.
We looked at the dirt. Limestone blocks proving the exact title of the Roman executioner, inscriptions proving early chronology, prison mosaics proving divine worship centuries before Constantine. And we looked at a mountain of thousands of manuscripts containing embedded oral traditions formulated within months of the events.
The secular debate in classical antiquity was never about whether Jesus of Nazareth lived. Virtually no ancient person, friend or foe, rabbi or pagan, denied that he existed, that he taught, that he performed unexplainable deeds, and that he was executed by the Roman Empire. The ancient debate was entirely about what his life meant.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought. It's something that isn't explicitly debated in the secular texts, but it is demanded by the sheer weight of them. If a single politically insignificant execution of a peasant teacher in a dusty, remote, perpetually rebellious province of the Roman Empire sparked the most textually abundant, socially explosive, and durable movement in all of classical antiquity, what does that say about the sheer, undeniable, magnetic gravity of the historical figure himself?
Regardless of whether one believes in the theology, the miracles, or the resurrection, the purely historical, socio-political footprint left behind by this one singular life defies all standard historical models. It is utterly unlike anything else in the entirety of human history.
It brings us right back to that broken X-ray machine. The picture of the ancient world might be murky. The dates can be messy, the translations debated, and the witness is highly hostile. But when you look at the sheer blinding impact radiating out from the center of that negative space, you cannot deny that something massive, something historically solid, is standing right there in the middle of the frame. Well, thank you to our listener for providing this brilliant, challenging stack of sources and for guiding us through the murky waters of history today. Keep digging into the dirt, keep questioning the texts, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.
That wraps it up for this deep dive. Thanks for watching A Moment in Time podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe.